A breakthrough for protesters in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, but they've vowed to carry on with their anti-government protests. This after the ruling Green Party said it was dropping a bill on, quote, foreign agents after 2 nights of violent demonstrations. Tens of thousands had rallied, saying the draft was inspired by a Russian law and represented an authoritarian shift. The legislation would have labeled any non-government or media as foreign agents if they received more than 20% of their funds from abroad. Opponents of the bill included President Salome Zorobashvili, who had said she'd veto it if it had crossed her desk. For more, I'm joined by our foreign editor, Philip Turle. Hello to you, Philip. Let's begin with, first of all, why did the government withdraw this legislation?
Well, according to the government, before we all get too excited that this legislation has been swept under the carpet and that's the end of it, the government says that it withdrew this legislation because it wasn't explained clearly enough to the people of Georgia, and that it was badly presented as well, and it needs to be reformulated. So that leads one to believe that this isn't the end of this attempt to try to push this legislation through, but the government has withdrawn it for the time being to overhaul what it was saying, with the hopes that it will be better accepted a second time round. The second point is that you mentioned the president saying that she would veto this legislation if it went through. She could do that, but the government still has the right to override that veto and push that legislation through Parliament. So it's not over yet. This is a reprieve. It's a victory for the protesters who, having seen this legislation approved already once, or their first reading, now can say to themselves, well, we have managed to have it withdrawn for the time being. It's important for the people of Georgia because they say that if this legislation had gone through, whereby organizations that receive more than 20% of funding from foreign institutions can then be seen as foreign-led organizations themselves, are therefore open to being more kept under the control of the authorities and could even be shut down or discredited. They're saying this is exactly what happened in Russia. The same legislation was passed in 2012. Since then, Vladimir Putin has closed down all opposition to the Russian government, and they certainly don't want to see that happening in Georgia.
Yeah, and within the past hour, we've seen the first reaction from the Kremlin. It's saying it's concerned by the unrest in Georgia. Philip, Georgia's in a tricky position, isn't it? I mean, on one hand, it's stuck between its desire for closer ties with the EU, but it does have very strong economic links with Russia.
Well, remember back in 2008, the war in which Russia took 2 areas of Georgia, Abkhazia and also South Ossetia. The country is heavily dependent on Russia. For example, there's a large agricultural production in Georgia for wine, for vines, for fruit and vegetables, which are all exported to Russia. There is a very large diaspora of Georgians living in Russia, very large estimate between 150,000 on one side up to 1 million on the other. And they send back at least $1.5 billion worth of money every year to the Georgian economy. So all of that can't be played around with too much. But at the same time, Georgia wants to become part of the European Union. It wants to join NATO. That's a no-go for the Kremlin, obviously. And they're keeping an eye about what's going on in Ukraine at the same time. So you see that there's a split between what Georgia would like, which is to have closer ties with the West. It's applied for membership status of the European Union. That hasn't been granted yet, as it has to Ukraine and also to Moldova. But at the same time, they can't really do away with their relationship with the Russians because they're too heavily dependent on Russia, and the historical context as well plays a lot into all of this. So it's not a simple situation for the people of Georgia to have to deal with at the moment.
All right, Philip, thank you very much. Philip Turle, France 24's foreign editor.